The words were a venomous whisper, meant only for her, a secret threat wrapped in the cheap cologne of a man who believed his tailored suit was a suit of armor. "You'll regret this at home." Mark hissed it, his lips barely moving, a cruel smirk twisting his handsome face into something ugly. His fingers tightened around Lena's wrist, the pressure a painful punctuation to his promise of punishment. The diner, a moment before filled with the gentle clatter of cutlery and the low hum of conversation, seemed to hold its breath. For a split second, the world was just the burning grip on her arm and the cold malice in his eyes. Lena didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She simply stood there, her own eyes, wide and clear as a summer sky, reflecting his rage without absorbing it. It was this stillness, this refusal to break, that always infuriated men like him. But Mark was oblivious to the world beyond his own petty tyranny. He didn't notice the old cook at the pass-through, window freeze, a ladle of gravy hovering over a plate of fries. He didn't see the couple in the corner booth stop their argument, their heads turning in unison. And he certainly didn't see the man in the back corner, the man who had been silently nursing a cup of black coffee for the past hour, the man who had not moved a single muscle until this exact moment. He didn't see him because men like Mark never look for threats in quiet corners. They only see the people they can dominate. The man in the corner heard every word. He heard the sibilant hiss of the threat, a sound that cut through the diner's low hum like a razor blade through silk. He saw the vicious tightening of the grip on Lena's wrist, saw the faint white mark it left on her skin, and in that frozen moment, something ancient and terrible awoke behind his calm gray eyes. A chair scraped against the worn linoleum floor. The sound was not loud, but in the sudden, suffocating silence, it was a thunderclap. Every head, except for Mark's, turned toward the source of the sound. The man stood up. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace that was more intimidating than any sudden motion. He wore a simple black jacket and dark jeans, clothes that spoke of a man who had no need to impress anyone. He was Lena's husband. And Mark, in his arrogant blindness, was unaware that he had just threatened the wife of the city's most feared, most respected, and most retired mafia boss. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the silence that had come before it. Not just the silence in the diner, but the silence of the past 5 years. A silence that Alex Chernov had built around himself and his wife, brick by painful brick. It began, as all such stories do, in a world of noise and violence. Alex had not been born into power. He had carved it from the gristle and bone of the city's underworld. He was known then not as Alex, the quiet man in the corner of a diner, but as Chernov, the ghost of the West End. He was a legend whispered in back alleys and boardroom meetings alike. His empire was built not on chaos, but on an almost monastic order. His rules were simple: absolute loyalty, unquestionable competence, and a strict, unwavering code. You do not harm women, you do not harm children, and you do not harm the innocent who are caught in the crossfire. To break one of Chernov's rules was to cease to exist. It was a simple, brutal calculus that had kept a bloody peace in the city for over a decade. His power was absolute. His control was total. He had everything a man in his position could want: wealth, respect, fear, and he had a family. A wife, Elena, who saw the man beneath the monster, and a daughter, Anya, a brilliant, laughing child with his gray eyes and her mother's gentle soul. Anya was the sun in his dark universe. She was the reason for the code. She was the one pure thing in a life built on impurity. The tragedy, when it came, was not a grand betrayal in a hail of gunfire. It was small and petty and utterly meaningless. A rival, a young upstart named Rico, too stupid to understand the rules of the game, decided to make a statement. He planted a bomb under Alex's car. But that day, Alex was late leaving a meeting. His wife had taken Anya to a piano lesson. They were the ones who turned the key. The noise of the explosion had echoed through the city, but for Alex, it was the beginning of the great silence. He found a piece of Anya's little red coat in the wreckage. That was all that was left. The vengeance that followed was not a storm. It was a glacier. Slow, silent and absolute. Alex didn't rage. He didn't scream. The fire in him turned to ice. Over the next month, Rico and his entire organization were systematically erased. Not just killed, erased. Their businesses were dismantled. Their bank accounts emptied. Their families sent away. With quiet warnings, their names removed from every record. By the end, it was as if they had never existed at all. It was his masterpiece of destruction, and it left him completely empty. The silence in his heart was now a vast, frozen wasteland. He walked away from it all. He handed the keys to his empire to his most trusted lieutenant, a man named Dmitri, with a single instruction: keep the peace, follow the code. Then, Alex Chernov vanished. He became a ghost in his own city. He drifted, a man hollowed out by grief, waiting for an end that wouldn't come. He found his reason to live in the most unexpected of places, a small, underfunded hospice on the edge of town. He was there, not for himself, but to visit an old associate, a man dying of cancer. And that's where he saw her, Lena. She was a volunteer nurse, moving through the rooms of the dying with a quiet grace that seemed to push back against the tide of sorrow. She wasn't beautiful in the way the women in his old life had been: hard, polished, and glittering. Lena's beauty was soft, luminous, like candlelight in a dark room. She had a patience that seemed infinite. She held the hands of dying men who had lived violent lives and listened to their final, rambling confessions without a hint of judgment. She cleaned up their messes, soothed their fevers, and treated each of them with a fundamental, unshakable dignity. He watched her for weeks, a silent observer in the background. He saw in her the same gentle soul that had lived in his wife, the same quiet strength. She was kindness made manifest. One evening, he saw a patient, a bitter old man, lash out at her, throwing a bedpan that splattered against the wall, just missing her head. The man screamed vile, hateful things at her. Lena didn't react with anger or fear. She simply picked up a cloth, her movements calm and measured, and began to clean the wall. When she was done, she turned to the old man, whose face was now contorted with shame. She placed a gentle hand on his. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're in pain. It's okay to be angry." In that moment, Alex felt the first crack in the ice around his heart. He saw that true strength wasn't the ability to destroy. It was the ability to endure, to absorb the ugliness of the world and reflect back something better. He started talking to her. Simple conversations at first, in the quiet hallways of the hospice. He learned about her past. She was an orphan, raised in a series of foster homes, some good, some terrible. She had her own history of pain, of being made to feel small and worthless by cruel people. But instead of making her hard, it had made her compassionate. She had dedicated her life to caring for those the world had forgotten. She saw in him a deep sadness, a man carrying a weight too heavy for any one person to bear. She didn't pry. She simply listened. She created a space where his silence felt safe. Slowly, painstakingly, he let her in. He told her about Anya. He told her about the life he had left behind, though he spared her the goriest details. He expected her to be horrified, to run from the monster he confessed to being. She didn't. She just listened, her eyes filled with a profound and sorrowful understanding. When he was finished, his voice raw, his soul laid bare, she took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. "That man is gone," she said softly. "The man I see is the one who sits with Mr. Peterson for hours, just so he doesn't have to die alone. That's the man who is real." They fell in love. It was a quiet, tentative thing, a delicate plant growing in the ruins of their lives. They married a year later, a simple ceremony at the courthouse with 2 of her nurse friends as witnesses. They made a pact. No more violence, no more secrets, just a quiet life. They bought a small house, and Lena got a job at the diner, the Morning Star, because she liked the simple, honest work and the rhythm of serving people. Alex worked as a freelance security consultant, a vague title that used his old skills for legitimate, boring purposes, analyzing blueprints for corporate buildings, advising on alarm systems. It was a peaceful life, a fragile peace. Alex knew that the ghost of his past would always be with him. He saw it sometimes in the way people on the street would quickly look away, a flicker of old fear in their eyes. He heard it in the too respectful tone of the local police sergeant who knew exactly who he was. He lived in constant, low-level vigilance, always watching, always listening, terrified that the world he had built with Lena would be shattered by the world he had left behind. His greatest fear was that his violence would one day touch her. He had built a fortress of silence and peace around her, and he would do anything to protect it. Which brought them to tonight. Lena had insisted on going on this date. It wasn't a romantic date, but a meeting. Mark was a distant cousin of one of the other waitresses. He worked in finance and had offered to give Lena free advice on starting a small savings plan. Lena, with her trusting nature, had seen it as a kind gesture. Alex had seen the truth in an instant. He had seen the predatory gleam in Mark's eyes when he'd picked her up, the way his gaze lingered too long, the proprietary way he placed a hand on the small of her back. Alex knew his type, the insecure tyrant, a man whose sense of self-worth was so fragile it could only be maintained by diminishing others. A bully. Alex hated bullies more than anything. He had offered to come with her, but Lena, wanting to show her independence, had gently refused. "It's just coffee, Alex," she had said, kissing him. "I can handle a financial advisor." But Alex couldn't shake the cold knot of dread in his stomach, so he had followed them. He had taken a seat in the back corner of the same diner where she worked, a place she had chosen, because she felt comfortable there. He kept his head down, hidden behind a newspaper, watching them in the reflection of the window. For the first hour, it was exactly as he'd expected. Mark wasn't talking about savings plans. He was talking about himself, his promotions, his car, his expensive watch, which he made sure to flash at every opportunity. He was condescending to Lena, explaining simple financial concepts as if she were a child. He was rude to the waitress serving them, a young girl named Chloe, snapping his fingers to get her attention. Lena handled it all with her usual grace, nodding politely, steering the conversation back to the reason for their meeting, her quiet dignity, a stark contrast to his loud arrogance. Alex watched, his jaw tight, his hands resting calmly on the table. He was a coiled spring, every instinct screaming at him to intervene, to put this pathetic man in his place. But he held back. For Lena, for their pact. This was her world, the normal world, and in this world, you didn't solve problems by breaking a man's jaw. He had to trust her to handle it. Then, the escalation. Mark, frustrated by Lena's refusal to be impressed or intimidated, grew more aggressive. He started making subtle digs at her job. "You must meet all sorts of interesting people here," he'd said, his tone dripping with disdain. "It's a good job," Lena had replied simply. "I like people." "Right," Mark sneered. "Still, you're too smart to be slinging hash forever. A woman like you needs a man to take care of her, to elevate her." His hand had crept across the table, covering hers. Lena had gently but firmly pulled her hand away. "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself," she said, her voice still soft, but with a new edge of steel. "Now, about that savings account you mentioned." This was the rejection that lit the fuse. Mark's mask of charm dropped completely, revealing the raw, ugly entitlement beneath. His movements became jerky, angry. He knocked over his water glass, the liquid flooding across the table. He immediately blamed her. "Look what you made me do," he snarled, as if his own clumsiness was her fault. Lena grabbed a handful of napkins, trying to contain the spill. "It's just water, it's all right," she said, trying to de-escalate. But Mark was beyond reason. He was a petty king whose subject had just defied him. He needed to reassert his dominance. He stood up, grabbing her by the wrist as she tried to clean the mess. And that's when he hissed the words, "You'll regret this at home." A threat of domestic violence, delivered in a public place, with the casual cruelty of a man who was certain there would be no consequences. In that moment, the pact Alex had made with Lena, the promise of a quiet life, became secondary, because the first pact, the one he had made with himself over the smoking ruins of his past, was to protect the innocent, and Lena was the most innocent person he had ever known. The chair scraped back. Alex stood up, and the 5 years of silence were over. The atmosphere in the diner shifted. It was a physical change, like a sudden drop in barometric pressure before a storm. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hairs on your arms stand up. The fear that had been a scattered, unfocused thing, pity for the waitress, discomfort at the man's aggression now coalesced. It found a new focal point. The tall, quiet man in the back. Mark was the last to notice. His entire world was still focused on Lena's face, on the victory he thought he was winning. "What's wrong?" he sneered, his grip still tight on her wrist. "Cat got your tongue?" He was enjoying her silence, mistaking her shock for submission. He felt a surge of power. This was control. This was how you taught a woman her place. Then he felt it. A shadow fell over him. Not just a physical shadow blocking the light, but a coldness, a weight that settled on his shoulders. He finally looked up, annoyance flashing across his face, ready to tell whoever it was to get lost. The words died in his throat. He was looking up into the calmest, coldest pair of gray eyes he had ever seen. They were like chips of granite. There was no anger in them, no rage. That would have been less terrifying. What he saw in those eyes was a complete and total absence of emotion. It was the look of a man studying an insect before crushing it. Alex didn't speak. He didn't have to. His presence spoke for him. It filled the space, pushing all the air out. Mark's bravado, a cheap and flimsy thing, began to crack. "Who the hell are you?" he managed to stammer, though the words lacked conviction. He tried to puff out his chest, to maintain his posture of dominance. It was like a poodle trying to intimidate a wolf. Alex's gaze flickered from Mark's face down to the hand gripping Lena's wrist. Then it moved back up to Mark's eyes. Still, he said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. The other patrons of the diner were frozen, a gallery of wax figures. They were no longer just witnesses to a domestic dispute. They were witnesses to a fundamental shift in the universal order of things. The bully was now facing something he could not comprehend. The old cook, a man named Sal, who had worked in the kitchens of this city for 50 years, recognized Alex immediately. Sal had seen Chernov only once before, years ago, when he had come into a 5-star restaurant where Sal was a line cook. Chernov had been there to have a quiet word with the owner, a man who had been skimming from the union pension fund. Sal remembered the silence that had fallen over that kitchen, too. He remembered the owner, a big, blustering man, turning pale and starting to sweat. The owner was never seen again. Sal made the sign of the cross under the stainless steel counter. This young fool had no idea what he had just stepped in. Mark's confusion was rapidly turning into fear. The cold finger of doubt that had touched him was now a frozen hand gripping his heart. Why was everyone staring? Why was this man looking at him with such finality? "I asked you a question," Mark said, trying to reclaim some shred of authority. "This is a private conversation." It was then that Alex spoke for the first time. His voice was low, quiet, and yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. It wasn't a shout. It was a statement of absolute fact. Let go of her. 3 simple words, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. Mark's hand recoiled from Lena's wrist as if it had been burned. The release was so sudden that Lena stumbled back a step. Alex's arms shot out, not to catch her, but to simply be there, a steadying presence for her to lean against. His eyes never left Mark's face. Lena moved to Alex's side, half hiding behind his formidable frame. She looked up, at her husband, and for the first time that night, she felt a tremor of fear. Not of Mark, but for him. She knew this look in Alex's eyes. She had only seen it once before, when he had told her the story of what happened to the men who had killed his daughter. It was the look of a man who had made a decision, a final one. Mark, now free from his target, tried to bluster his way out. "Hey, look, pal, I don't know who you are, but this is between me and my girlfriend," he lied, gesturing toward Lena. Alex's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. "She is not your girlfriend," Alex stated, his voice flat and devoid of inflection. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. Mark took an involuntary step back. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, It had been completely inverted. The hunter was now the prey. "She is my wife," Alex said, the words hanging in the air like crystals of ice. A collective gasp went through the diner. The quiet waitress, the one everyone knew as Gentle Lena, was married to this man. Mark's face went from pale to chalk white. The pieces were clicking into place in his mind, and the picture they formed was terrifying. The quiet confidence, the absolute command of the room, the way everyone else was looking at him with a mixture of fear and pity. I didn't know," he stammered, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Look, man, it was just a misunderstanding. We were having a little argument, that's all." Alex stopped, standing a few feet from him. He was perfectly still. "A misunderstanding," Alex repeated, the words toneless. It wasn't a question. It was a dissection. He turned his head slightly, his gaze falling on Lena. "Lena," he said, his voice now softening almost imperceptibly. "What did he say to you?" Lena hesitated. Part of her wanted to end this, to say it was nothing, to pull Alex away and go back to their quiet life. But she looked at Mark, at his cowardly backtracking face, and she remembered the sting of his words, the humiliation of his grip. She remembered all the other Marks from her past, the foster fathers, the condescending teachers, the bullies who mistook her kindness for weakness, and she realized that silence was what allowed them to thrive. She straightened her back, stepping out from behind her husband. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and steady. "He said I would regret this at home." She said it to Alex, but she looked directly at Mark. For the first time, Mark saw not a victim, but an accuser. Alex turned his gaze back to Mark. The emptiness in his eyes was now gone. It had been replaced by something far worse, a cold, calculating purpose. "Tell me," Alex said, his voice a low murmur. "What, exactly, was she going to regret?" Mark started to sweat. His expensive suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket. "Nothing," he said quickly, his voice high and strained. "It was just a figure of speech. I didn't mean anything by it, I swear." "A figure of speech," Alex echoed. He took another step forward. Mark was now backed up against his table. "You put your hands on my wife. You threatened her. And you did it in public, because you wanted to feel powerful, because you thought she was alone." Alex's voice was still quiet, but every word was a judgment, a nail being hammered into the coffin of Mark's life. "You are a coward," Alex stated simply, "and cowards need to be taught a lesson." This was the moment Mark's fear finally boiled over into panic. He looked around wildly, searching for an ally, an exit, anyone who would help him. He saw only faces staring back at him, devoid of sympathy. He was the one who was alone now. "You can't do this," he squeaked. "I'll call the cops. This is harassment." A faint, humorless smile touched Alex's lips. It was a terrifying sight. "The police will not be a problem," Alex said with absolute certainty. He reached into his pocket. Mark flinched, expecting a weapon. Instead, Alex pulled out a simple, sleek black smartphone. He held it up. "In my old life," Alex said, his voice conversational, as if he were explaining a business strategy, "we had a very specific way of dealing with men who hurt women." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "It was messy. It was violent. It solved the problem, but it created others. It was a loud solution for a loud world." His thumb moved gracefully over the screen of the phone. "But I live in a quiet world now," he continued, his eyes locked on Mark's. "And quiet worlds require quiet solutions." He found the contact he was looking for. The name on the screen just said Dimitri. "You see, the mistake you made was not just in threatening my wife," Alex explained patiently. "It was in underestimating the consequences. You believe that power comes from a loud voice, a fancy title, a firm grip. You are wrong." He pressed the call button. "True power," he said as the phone began to ring, "is the ability to remake a man's world with a single, quiet phone call." The phone was answered on the first ring. "Dimitri," Alex said, his voice calm and level. He didn't wait for a reply. "I have a name for you. Mark Peterson, Vice President of Acquisitions at Sterling Thorne Investments." He spelled the last name slowly and clearly. "He has an offshore account in the Caymans, a slush fund he uses to skim from corporate expense reports. He has a gambling problem, a significant debt to a bookie in the East District, and for the past 6 months, he has been falsifying quarterly reports to hide a series of bad investments that have cost his clients millions. Alex recited this information as if reading from a grocery list. Mark's face, if possible, grew even paler. His jaw hung open. How? How could this man know all of that? Alex had made it his business to know. The moment Lena had told him about her financial meeting, Alex had made a call, a simple background check. Dimitri's people were thorough. They hadn't just found Mark's public records. They had unearthed every dirty little secret he thought was safely buried. Alex had hoped he wouldn't need to use the information. He had hoped it would just be a precaution, but Mark had forced his hand. "I want you to liquidate him," Alex said into the phone, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet each word was perfectly clear. "Not physically. I want him socially and financially erased." He listened for a moment. "Yes, everything. The information on the falsified reports goes to the SEC, anonymously. The information about the slush fund goes to the IRS. The information about his gambling debts, send it to his firm's board of directors, and his wife." Mark made a small choking sound. He was married. Of course he was. "When you are done," Alex concluded, "I want his credit score to be a single digit. I want his professional reputation to be radioactive. I want every door he tries to open to be slammed shut in his face. I want him to spend the rest of his life working a menial job, struggling to pay rent on a tiny apartment, remembering this night every time he looks in the mirror." He paused again. "Yes, Dimitri. A lesson in consequences. Thank you." He ended the call. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. The entire process had taken less than 90 seconds. Alex looked at the broken man in front of him. Mark was trembling, his eyes wide with disbelief and horror. His entire life, the life he had built his arrogant identity upon, had just been dismantled in a quiet phone call. His career was over. His marriage was over. His future was a barren wasteland. You can't," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. "It's already done," Alex said. "The gears are already turning. By morning, you will be a ghost, a man who used to be someone." The front door of the diner chimed. 2 men entered. They were both dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits. They were large, impassive, and moved with the same quiet efficiency as Alex. They were Dimitri's men, the lieutenants. They had clearly been waiting outside. They walked directly to the table, their eyes not even glancing at the other patrons. One of them stood on either side of Mark. They didn't touch him. They just stood there, their presence an undeniable command. "Mr. Peterson," one of them said, his voice polite but firm, "will be escorting you home." The implication was clear. They were there to make sure he didn't do anything stupid, to make sure he went home to face the immediate fallout of the life he had just lost. Mark looked from the 2 men to Alex, his face a mask of pleading desperation. "Please," he begged. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'll do anything." Alex did not respond to him. Instead, he turned to his wife. He took her hand, the one Mark had gripped, and gently rubbed the red marks on her wrist. "Lena," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "What do you want?" This was the final piece of the lesson. Agency. He was giving the power back to her. He had dismantled the bully, but she had to be the one to deliver the final verdict. Lena looked at the pathetic, weeping man who had threatened her just minutes before. She felt a surge of pity, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, clear resolve. Pity was a luxury for men like him. He had never shown it to anyone, and he didn't deserve it now. She did not want him physically harmed. That was not who she was. But she wanted justice. She wanted him to understand. She stepped forward, her gaze unflinching. "I want you to learn," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I want you to spend years understanding what it feels like to be powerless, to be dismissed, to be treated as if you are less than nothing." She looked at the 2 suited men. "Take him," she said. It was a command, and it was obeyed instantly. The 2 men each placed a firm but gentle hand on Mark's arms. He didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him completely. He was a hollow shell. They escorted him out of the diner, a broken man being led to the first day of his new, miserable life. The door chimed shut behind them. And then, the diner exhaled. The spell was broken. A low murmur of conversation started to bubble up. Someone let out a shaky laugh. The young waitress, Chloe, leaned against the counter, her hand over her heart. Alex turned his full attention back to Lena. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with concern. She nodded, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of fear or sadness. It was a tear of release. "I am now," she whispered. He pulled her into a gentle embrace, his large frame surrounding her, a fortress of safety and love. The silence between them was no longer a pact to be kept. It was a shared space of understanding. From the kitchen, the old cook, Sal, emerged. He was wiping his hands on his apron. He walked over to their table. He didn't look at Alex with fear, but with a deep, profound respect. "In my life," Sal said, his voice a gravelly rumble that commanded attention, "I have seen many strong men." The diner quieted down again, listening to the impromptu speech from its oldest resident. "I've seen men who could lift a car, men who could win a fight with their bare hands, men who could command armies of thugs with a single word." He looked around the room, at all the faces watching him. "But that is not strength, that is just force. It is noise." He turned his gaze to Alex, who had released Lena but still stood protectively by her side. "True strength," Sal said, his voice resonating with the wisdom of age, "is what we saw tonight. It is the power to protect, the will to defend the quiet and the gentle from the loud and the cruel." He then looked at Lena, and his weathered face broke into a warm smile. "And it is the courage to stand up and speak the truth, even when your voice is shaking. You both did a good thing tonight." He nodded once, a gesture of finality, and turned to go back to his kitchen. "This meal is on the house," he called back over his shoulder. A smattering of applause broke out in the diner. It was for Sal's words. It was for Lena's courage. And it was for the quiet, terrifying justice they had all just witnessed. Alex paid the other patrons no mind. He led Lena back to their corner booth. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the familiar, comforting rhythm of the diner slowly reasserting itself around them. "You broke our pact," Lena said softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple observation. Alex looked down at his hands, which were resting on the table. He saw the faded tattoos on his knuckles, ghosts of a life he tried to forget. "Some things are more important than a pact," he said, his voice low. "Protecting you, that is the only rule that matters now." He looked up, and his eyes were filled with a deep, aching vulnerability. "That life, Lena, the noise, the violence, it was a prison. I thought I had escaped it, but tonight, I realized I never will. Not completely. It's not the same, Alex," she said, covering his hands with hers. "What you did before, that was for power, for control. What you did tonight, that was for me, that was for justice." "Was it?" he asked, his voice filled with genuine doubt. "Or was it just the monster, let out of its cage for a little while?" "No," Lena said, her voice firm, unwavering. "The monster destroys. You created something. You created safety. You took a man who causes pain, and you sentenced him not to pain, but to understanding. You sentenced him to empathy, whether he wants it or not. He will now know what it is to be weak. That is not a monster's work. That is the work of a good man." Her words were a balm on a wound he didn't even know was still bleeding. He had spent 5 years terrified of the man he used to be, terrified that that man would claw his way out and destroy the fragile peace he had built. But Lena saw it differently. She saw that the skills he had learned in that dark world could be used for good, that his capacity for ruthless efficiency could be a shield for the defenseless. He was not a monster in a cage. He was a guardian on the wall. He squeezed her hand, a lifetime of gratitude in the simple gesture. "I love you," he whispered. "I know," she whispered back. "Now, let's go home, to our quiet life." They left the diner a few minutes later, stepping out into the cool night air. The city lights glittered around them, but their world felt small and safe and entirely their own. Months passed. The incident at the diner became a local legend, a story whispered among the regulars, growing with each telling. The story of the quiet waitress and her terrifying, silent husband. For Lena and Alex, however, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. But something had changed. The fragility was gone. Their quiet life no longer felt like something they had to hide and protect from the world. It felt like a fortress, strong and secure. Lena found a new confidence in herself. She still moved with her characteristic gentleness, but now there was an unshakable core of steel beneath it. She no longer shied away from confrontation. When a supplier tried to overcharge the diner, she calmly and methodically laid out the facts, refusing to back down until they corrected the invoice. When a customer was rude to Chloe, the young waitress, Lena intervened with a quiet authority that left the customer apologizing. She had found her voice. She had discovered that her kindness was not a weakness to be exploited, but a strength to be wielded. One day, Alex came home from work and handed her a set of keys and a folder of documents. Inside was the deed to the Morning Star Diner. He had bought it. "It's yours," he said simply. "Sal is staying on as head cook, but you're the boss." Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him. "Alex, why?" "Because you deserve a place that is truly yours," he said. "A place where you can be safe, and where you can make others feel safe too." And so, she did. Under Lena's management, the diner thrived. It became more than just a place to eat. It became a sanctuary, a haven for the lonely and the lost, a place where a warm meal and a kind word were always on the menu. Lena knew every regular by name, knew their stories, their struggles, their small victories. She had created a community, bound together by empathy and mutual respect. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, a man came into the diner. He was thin and haggard, dressed in a cheap, ill-fitting uniform from a janitorial service. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollowed out with a permanent expression of exhaustion and defeat. He sat at the counter, avoiding everyone's gaze, and ordered a black coffee. Lena was the one who served him. She placed the cup down in front of him, and for a moment, their eyes met. A flicker of recognition sparked in his tired eyes, followed by a wave of shame so profound it was almost a physical thing. It was Mark. He looked 10 years older. The arrogance was gone, sandblasted away by months of humiliation and hardship. The tailored suit was replaced by a stained work shirt. The expensive watch was gone, his wrist bare and thin. He was exactly what Alex had promised he would become, a ghost of his former self. Lena felt no triumph, no satisfaction, just a deep, quiet sadness for the wasted potential, for the life ruined by its own cruelty. Mark tried to speak, to apologize, but the words wouldn't come out. He just stared at her, his face a mess of regret. Lena simply gave him a small, sad smile. She pushed a plate with a slice of apple pie toward him. "On the house," she said softly. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was an act of grace, a final lesson that true strength was not in crushing your enemies, but in having the power to do so and choosing, instead, to show them a sliver of the kindness they had never shown to others. Mark looked at the pie, then back at her, and his shoulders began to shake as silent, racking sobs overtook him. He had finally, truly understood. Lena walked away, leaving him to his grief and his pie, and went back to work. Later that evening, as she and Alex closed up the diner, she told him who had come in. Alex listened, his expression unreadable. They stood in the quiet darkness of the empty diner, the only light coming from the streetlights outside. "Did I do the right thing, Alex?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "By giving him the pie? By showing him mercy?" Alex turned to her, and in the dim light, she could see the profound love and pride in his eyes. He took her in his arms, holding her close. "My old life was about vengeance," he said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. "Vengeance is a fire that burns everything, including the person who wields it. It leaves nothing but ash." He pulled back slightly, looking down at her face. "What you showed him today was not mercy. It was justice, the highest form of justice." He gently touched her cheek. Vengeance is about making someone feel what you felt. Justice is about making them understand why they were wrong. You gave him a moment of undeserved kindness, and in that moment, you showed him the true depth of his own cruelty. You didn't just break him, you taught him. He smiled, a true, warm smile that reached his gray eyes. You are the strongest person I have ever known, Lena Chernov. And in the quiet of their diner, in the heart of their peaceful life, they both knew that the silence was no longer empty. It was full of strength, full of hope, and full of a love that had been forged in the crucible of violence and redeemed by the power of quiet kindness. The lesson of that night was simple, yet profound. It echoed in the clatter of plates at the Morning Star, in the grateful smiles of its patrons, and in the quiet, watchful presence of the man in the back corner who had once been a king of a violent world and was now, simply, the husband of a good woman. The lesson was this: bullies thrive on noise and fear. Their power is a fragile illusion, built on the silence of those they intimidate. But true strength, the kind that endures, the kind that can remake a world, is quiet. It is calm. It is absolute. And it is found not in the clenched fist, but in the open hand, offered in protection, in community, and, sometimes, in the most unexpected and devastating act of grace.